forget. So I'm very excited to introduce Aman to this group. He's been here with us before, but he's going to share some of his deep wisdom and thinking and insight and reflection based on his work, which is basically in Canada doing, he and the organization that he works with systems change and hangs out at the interface of lots of different organizational, government, philanthropy, grassroots organizations looking to help figure out how do we do deep systems change for our world and the future. So I'm really excited to hear what he's been learning and thinking about around that. And then we'll do an audible. We'll either stay in a large group and continue our conversation and ask them some great probing questions, or we'll go into small groups and give us a meaty question to kind of reflect on. Aman has he comes out of marine biology, and so he was introduced early on as into ecosystems thinking, and so he's been bringing that lens and that perspective into his change work and his community work with Black communities and also some Indigenous communities north of Toronto. So I will, I know Aman through the International Leadership Association. He chairs the Leadership for Peace member community group. And so I've always loved the way he thinks about the world, and I'm excited that he's willing to share. So Aman, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Kati, and thanks all of you for on this day choosing to spend a bit of reflective time with me, and for all of us to be able to think about some of the things that I will be sharing with you. So I'm coming to you with a sense of learning and humility, and I'm always in the presence of people that are like me and my peers here, north of the border, so to speak, in Canada, trying and exploring things that challenge us as leaders, but also challenge our environment in terms of working different. So for today, I will be sharing slides, as I was saying earlier on to Kati. Usually, I'm kind of a community organizer at heart that is comfortable with flip charts and then, work in the room, so to speak. But in this virtual environment, we will try to do what we can with sharing slides as we go along. And I look forward as I share my thoughts to hear from you about your experiences and experimentation around the work that you do. So please, I'm also someone who speaks fast, and so if you please feel free to stop me if you have something that you need to ask or it's not clear. So I'm kind of organizing my sharing today around this idea of how do we, the context and the example is Black communities, but this could be applicable to any community per se, because we're talking about trying to, through the work that we're doing around systems change, tackle inequity and create the conditions for tackling inequity. So, and using an ecosystem lens to the work that we're doing. So in essence, I think without taking a lot of time, Black communities, like many other racialized and marginalized communities in any geographic context, we're talking about Canada, but it could apply to many other countries. They are confronted by a set of socioeconomic challenges that put them in the periphery of society. When you pick any of those indicators, whether it's in education or economic inclusion, housing, you name it, the challenges are systemic, and often for Black communities are historical and generational. Yeah. And because of that, the organization that I lead, called the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, that's now this year 5 years old, is exclusively focusing on systems change, we've been asking ourselves, like, what's our gift and offering to the solutions that we want to see here in Canada, in Black communities. And after a number of iterative reflections and work that we've been doing, we start saying, okay, maybe this is about ecosystem change. And I will come back later on when we talk about some of the Afrocentric values. They actually lead us in that way. So we've been thinking about this way of organizing our work called the Black ecosystem approach. And at the center of this, we're recognizing that we need collaborative solutions. And we need to somehow start creating a different environment where we move away from reducing our challenges to simply seeking solutions that are simplistic and often band-aid solutions. Yeah. And we realized that in this mapping of the stakeholders that are involved in systems change, and there are many of them, we'll talk about those, that we need actually an architecture of engagement that brings literally around the table all the key actors in our communities that have somehow touched the problem. And for that, I think we need to figure out how do we build an architecture of engagement so that people are coming into the vantage point, so to speak, from their own niche and so on. And in doing that, as a former marine ecologist myself, and there was a specialization in coral reef ecologists, and I have done this work in many tropical seas and oceans, mostly in the global south, from Mauritius to the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf and then the Red Sea and so on. Well, the invitation of us of imagining an ecosystem such as, a coral reef ecosystem, or it could be a forest ecosystem or a mangrove or any type of ecosystem, you realize that the ecosystem has actually diverse components. There are different players within the ecosystem, yeah. And for the ecosystem to be in balance, so to speak, remain healthy and vibrant, it's very important that the relationship among the various components, in this case of a coral reef ecosystem, are really well understood. And I think what keeps the ecosystem vibrant and going is the flow and the patterns that you see in terms of exchange of resources, nutrients, currents, sunlight. Corals have a role to play, fishes have a role to play, algae, and all the various components of a coral reef ecosystem have a role to play. But there's also a collective role that they play in relationship to each other. Yeah. So there is complementarity there. And there is the system has the capacity to recognize actually duplication and redundancy and optimize the use of its energy. So what often happens, and as I always talk to folks in the work that we do, whether it's talking about human ecosystems, coral reef ecosystems, forests, or any type of ecosystem, the principles that guide the functioning of ecosystems are almost the same. You're talking about patterns, relationships, flow, complementarity, and many other things. In the context of Black communities or any other community where you are dealing with systemic challenge around housing, around employment, around income security, and so on, you realize that some of the simplistic approaches to try to solve the problem of the ecosystem won't work. You need to actually start to deconstruct and say, well, what's happening here? Or another way of looking at what's getting in the way of finding solutions, yeah? And so in the work that we do, we've been saying, traditionally, in traditional African society, we say it takes a village to raise a child, yeah? In fact, it takes a village to raise solutions for Black communities or any other communities for that matter. So the key question is how do we mobilize the village? One of the things that would come to mind. So part of this is like our entity organization is a network. It's not a center. It's intentionally called the network. So when we do our work, actually work with organizations, but more and more we're bringing organizations around networks. So we have nodes around housing, around mental health, around education, around child welfare, and so on. And so our role is actually trying to pay attention at that connectedness between these nodes. So when you look at housing, for example, housing is a determinant of many other things. So for those of you that are familiar with this concept of the social determinants of health, you will see that, some of the things listed here, like housing, mental health, education, and so on, they are actually determinants of health. And so the key question becomes, if you put an ecosystem lens to this, how do we actually intentionally invest in various nodes? For example, around housing, there are a number of players that are actually rowing, sometimes alone, trying to tackle a systemic challenge such as housing, which require actually the intervention of private sector government, non-profit social housing providers, youth organization, women's organization, many players. So the key is to find an architecture of engagement of all these housing players so that they can start at least driving in the same highway. They might be in different lanes, but at least there's a meeting of the minds as they move forward to tackle a systemic challenge such as housing. In this particular case, for example, what we have done is we have run 4 roundtables, actually town halls across the country with Black leaders. We met with the Minister for Housing. We brought the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation, which is an arm's length government organization in Canada that manages, so to speak, the housing file in this country. So we were able to really, through facilitated conversations, to really understand what's getting in the way of Black youths actually fully participating in the affordable housing strategy in this country. We came up with specific recommendations that we harvested out of the town halls. So we play our convening role there. And then we went back to the minister, went back to CMHC, the corporation, and said, okay, here are some key recommendations. And one of those is building, for example, a resource center. So now CMHC is investing in building the first, through Black leaders and others in play, the first Black technical housing resource center as a platform to really bring all these various players to work together, that architecture that I was talking about. So part of the challenge in this fragmented world is like when governments and funders fund, they fund projects, they fund silos. They don't fund relationships. They don't fund collaborations. They don't fund between the lines and the nodes. And that's one of the challenges that we're trying to surface and say, hey, let's step back and not be lost in the trees. Let's look at the forest first. And we start looking at a different image and saying, okay, what's the role that we can play that might be different? So we need a shift. So in our work, that when we talk about the Black ecosystem approach, we're intentionally talking about 10 different shifts that we want to promote. And this Black ecosystem approach that we have launched, it's an outlook of the next 3 to 5 years. It's actually talking to the village. It's mobilizing the village to think differently. So we wanted to really look at a coordinated Black community sector. We wanted to move to innovation and creativity rather than business as usual, from singular interventions to collaborative interventions, moving away from traditional capacity building, workshopping, and training people to that, to actually move to learning and adaptive capacity. Working with governments and funders to move from this transactional world that we are, one of funding and reporting, to one of actually transformation. So from transactions to transformations, move away from heroic leadership models. We have all these, frontliners, leaders that think they can deliver solutions for our communities. They can't. Even governments can't. We need the entire village to actually work together. So how do we actually start nurturing collective leadership? Again, with care and empathy. Move to a data-friendly environment so that we build that culture of data and data friendliness that we don't have at the moment. How do we build sustainable and resilient Black organizations than the precarious environment that we have now? Services and programs are important, but they treat the symptoms of our systemic challenge. They are always responding to the tip of the iceberg. How do we start actually investing intelligently in service and programs, but also within the context of systems change? How do you start designing programs and services so that they actually move to create the conditions for systems change? And the last shift that we're proposing here is a shift that how do we move from traditional HR, traditional human resource management to a a mindset of actually retaining and investing in talent. And we'll talk later on, but also how do we actually give space and invest in young leaders? How do we talk about succession plan? How do we lay the foundation for the times we are not around, the next 5, 10, 20, 15 years? Yeah. So when we talk about an ecosystem approach, we're talking about intentional shifts. And this doesn't happen if we don't shift our relationships, our discussions, our funding practices, and our approach to leadership. So I think we'll come back to this, but I think in the ecosystem parlance here, we're talking about we must make some shifts. Yeah. And how do we do our work in terms of doing the shifts? So earlier on, I spoke about the housing example. Yeah. So that was a convening role that we played. Yeah. We convened, Black leaders across the country in various seats. We brought the housing minister. We had difficult but necessary conversation about the state of housing in Black communities in this country. He brought the Canada mortgage housing folks to the table. And from that dance, we start, moving in a different direction and starting to build the stepping stones for real change to come. But knowledge mobilization is important also. Like, what are we learning that we can actually infuse into the village, so to speak? Yeah. Some of the case examples of things that are working, how do we amplify them and put them out there? There's a role that we play around service coordination, working with governments. How do we ensure that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing? How do we avoid duplication? Yeah. How do we optimize, services from a design perspective so that, we're covering the gaps that we see in the ecosystem or in the village. Evaluation and learning. We have started to move from a concept of capacity building to one of learning. Yeah, from training to learning effectiveness. Yeah, and I think in doing that, we're saying, okay, as commonsensical as it sounds, at the core of systems change is actually learning. But how do we become? I think I've heard this from Kathy. How do we become active learners? Yeah, and so learning is important. It's not just painting the landscape with workshops. It's actually bringing that critical lens based on data and evidence. And so how do we learn from in context, so that learning is embedded to actually program design? Learning is embedded in terms of how we change cultures in organizations. Learning is embedded how we actually work as partners in solution with philanthropy, government, all the actors that have a bearing on the solutions that we want to see in communities. We do a lot of research and policy. Earlier, I was mentioning a research that we have done with Carleton University in Ottawa, that it's the unfunded report that clearly showed for every $100 that circulates in Canada from philanthropic foundations, whether private or community foundations, only 7 cents come to Black communities. That insight, that knowledge created some real interest and movement by philanthropy, by governments in terms of addressing the inequity that we have there. So research and knowledge is important, but how do you mobilize that so that you can create conditions for change? Here we are national in scope, but here in Ontario, working with the Ontario government, also we do granting. And we've been intentional about how we use grant as an instrument. And that's why we're calling it smart grant making, for relationship building, working together, not just dispersing funding, but understanding the organizations and the networks that we're investing in, and identify not just the disbursement of dollars, but how do we put wraparound supports, if you want, for those that are we are funding? How do we learn with them? How do we work with them? And we usually, when we do that, we're working for the next 2-3 years. So there's a learning, a knowledge mobilization framework, a learning approach out of the granting that we're doing. So collectively, these interventions, what we're calling strategic pillars, they are meant to create the conditions for systems change for us. That's what we think in terms will help us to start shifting the practice, that like the shift that we have to make. But this is, is good in terms of a frame of organizing our work and practice. But unless we have, some principles that guide our work, especially in the context of people of African descent, and when we talk about Black communities are not homogeneous. They are so diverse. In Canada, we have Afro-Nova Scotians that came here long before Canada was created, 400 years ago, you know, and we have Africans and people of African descent that come from the continent, from the Caribbean, from various parts of the world, Afro-Brazilians. So it's a very heterogeneous, community. But there are some guiding principles and values that bring all these communities together, like many other communities. Like if you engage, indigenous community, you will see that there are, the seven grandfathers' teachings, for example, the thinking about the seven generations and so on. In the context of Black communities, some of the values that you see here and principles that are traditionally known as the Nguzo Saba principles, that of unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. Somehow this infuse how we work among ourselves, how we relate to others. Yeah. So these are good principles to pay attention to from an Afrocentric lens. So when you talk about evaluation, for example, yeah, some of the work that we have been doing with indigenous and Black communities in Canada. So how do we, what does it mean to, if you put an indigenous lens to knowledge systems and evaluation? And correspondingly, if you put an Afrocentric lens, what would be different? And we do the same around organizational capacity, for example. When you think about governance, how would governance be different if you envelop it in an Afrocentric mantle, so to speak? How would board meetings be different? How would board members work? There are certain things that are not negotiable from any locus of practice, whether it's governance, operations, whatever in an organization. But there is latitude in the how you apply, how you implement when you put certain lens. So these principles are important. Again, principles are good as a guidance. The strategy that I shared earlier on in terms of the pillars are important, but are not sufficient in themselves. You actually need show and tell demonstration initiatives or learning labs for people to come together and work. So what we have done, starting 2 years and counting, in the last 2 years and counting, we are in the process of launching 12 different transformative initiatives. We've launched last year, we did a soft launch on a Center of Excellence for Black Youth Economic Empowerment. Some of these initiatives, we might incubate them and release them, so to speak, working with partners. We don't need necessarily to run them. So that's the other things, like we are a catalyst, we are an enabler, yeah? And from a sense of servant and collaborative leadership, looking at the ecosystem, actually, our best role is to create the conditions for others to come and work with us. Yeah, we're in the process of launching a national learning institute, and for the first go, we're focusing on Afrocentric evaluation, capacity building, and Black governance and leadership around this institute. Yeah, and we're doing it in collaboration with a Black Community Health Center here in Toronto. We're scaling a very successful institute that we launched when in my days at United Way, when I was in the senior management team, called City Leaders, the Creative Institute of Toronto Black Leaders, yeah, Toronto Young Leaders. Now we're taking this and saying, how do we scale this at the national level, yeah? So this is a matter of scaling, yeah? The State of Black Communities biannual report, this is a scorecard. It's almost like the vital signs, yeah? If you took a look at the socioeconomic indicators and using data and evidence, like benchmarking where we are, and using that periodically every 2 years, looking at the progress that we're making or not, and based on that, informing policy and funding practices. Yeah. So some of these initiatives that you see are meant to actually allow Black leaders to come and work together with their allies outside Black communities, with sector and charitable and nonprofit sector allies, governments, philanthropy. And a lot of our work at the moment is actually preparing the land, so to speak. It's tilling the soil so that we're creating the conditions for people through these transformative initiatives to come and try new approaches. And in trying these new approaches, the recurrent theme here is systems change. We're not running services and programs. We're using this actually as show and tell to try to start shifting the paradigm for Black communities and how they work with others. And so, and in doing that, I think we're we're not starting from scratch. Some of the initiatives were tried elsewhere within the Black community or outside the Black community, and either we're scaling or we're creating a new context for people to start working together. There are certain things that are kind of in the new domain. So intentionally bringing Black and Indigenous leaders. In Canada, as in Turtle Island here in North America, we talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There are a number of recommendations that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission invites us as treaty people to pay attention to. So we need to educate our Black leaders about their obligation as treaty people in their relationship with Indigenous communities in this country. And in doing that, we're thinking about, we're working on launching a leadership institute that brings, Indigenous and Black leaders together. One of the things that we've been working, for example, let me see here, the fellowship and residence program. We're openly talking about my generation, the elder generation, that's playing a different role, to really work with our young leaders in new ways, both intergenerationally, but also intentionally yielding space, stepping back, allow the young leaders to lead, playing a different mentoring and supportive role that we do. So last year, we launched the first Black community eldership program, where actually we have now an elder in residence program. And we have recruited our first elder, who's an elder that has held the space for so many years around advancing the work around food security and food sovereignty. And we're investing in him to start emulating and new practices that will allow him to work with young leaders through this residence program. So change doesn't happen if you don't intentionally invest in the change process itself. And I think, like, by really creating this fellowship and residence program for young leaders and elders, we're signaling to our communities, let's come back, work together in ways that we have not tried before. So we're openly creating the space to have the discussions about change and succession planning. We're saying, like, our role in this generation is to plant the seeds for the change that we want to see in the coming generations. Yeah. So when everything's said and done here, if we're stepping back and looking at the forest, whether in this case we're using a marine ecosystem metaphor or a forest metaphor, whatever, we need some principles that guide our work. We need some initiatives that are transformative in nature, that will allow people to come together and work together for that change. But also we need to name the shifts as we have done. We need to say we're moving from this to this, and here's how we're moving. And in doing that, I think we're signaling to all of us, starting from us as the facilitators, as those holders of space, that we are entering a zone of discomfort, where for some time we have to learn and practice different, so that we see the change that we want to see. So in the end, one of the questions that is coming to me that is timely and important is, like, how do we shift the mindset of our leaders? Because when we sit at the policy table with governments, and we do that often, senior folks of government, ministers, and sometimes the premiers and the prime minister and the mayors, when we have a discussion with them, unless the mindset of our leaders is in the right place, those discussions become about simple solutions, about projects, about funding, instead about relationship, flow and collaboration, and the type of conversations that we need to have that are going to create the conditions for systems change. So for us, I think we cannot avoid this question. We come at this question again and again because we see it playing out in the work that we do. It's easier for governments and funders to put funding programs and put in the hands of organizations and leaders resources and be in this reporting cycle. In the province where I am, in Canada, called Ontario, if you take Black youth unemployment has been twice the provincial average and has been there now for more than 20 years. It's not the lack of programs and services. It's the lack of really trying to tackle the underlying causes, the structural problems that are keeping Black youth in the periphery. It's not surprising that there is a link between Black youth unemployment and incarceration rates and higher participation in child welfare systems, a higher contact, with justice systems, high dropout rates from the school system. Everything is interconnected. So if we were to really put a systems change mantle to this so that we can lay the foundation for medium to long-term change, we need to start in the mind of our leaders, because the mind of our leaders at the moment is conditions to deliver and think simple solutions, which at the end of the day, they are not going to deliver the types of results that we need. I stop here, and I know I have taken a lot of time talking, but I really love to see your reactions, and I'm happy to flip back to any of the slides that you want me to. But at the end, I think for me, recognizing this, that unless we work at the level of pattern, relationship, and flow, and so on, we're literally spinning our wheels, because for Black communities, the challenges are historical. Like, we're not talking about my generation. We're talking about generations past having the same conversations. What's different now, probably we know more, we have data and so on. And it will be tragic if my children in 15, 20 years are having the same conversation. For me, it's the legacy, it's about laying the foundation. And the biggest wake up is to really get our leaders in community, our leaders in government, our leaders in philanthropy, in the private sector, in the faith sector, to really think that our challenges cannot be resolved by any of them, that require collaborative solutions. Yeah. So I'll stop here, and maybe I'll pass it back to Kathy, and we can proceed. Yeah.
That's great. So thank you, Aman. I'm so glad we've recorded this, because there were so many nuggets throughout this, and all kinds of mindset shifts that I'm already making about, like, going from capacity building to learning about, change doesn't happen unless we invest in the process, like all of those things. So I'm really grateful for everything that you've shared, and I'm glad I will be able to get to go back. So let's open it up to the group just for now, just for some other questions that we might have for Aman, before we maybe even tackle that great question that he left us at the end around how do we change the mindset of our leaders. But any other questions about anything else Aman shared, the work, these frameworks that he shared with us? Questions? Thoughts, comments?
I made a connection to some of the things that I've been reading in the resilience science literature, which is complementary to what you've learned and are practicing, Aman, which is in what they're finding in the resilience literature, anchored in the sustainability kind of context, is that you can't create solutions that are just about sustainability. You also have to think about, because all of these kind of systems are intersectional. So you have the economic system, the social system, the sustainability system. And if you're trying to figure out how to create a sustainable harvest in fisheries, in fish ecosystems, for example, if you only focus on the sustainability side of it, and you don't look at the social impact to the families that are gaining a living off of fishing, and the economic impacts of carrying load debt and other kinds of things, you won't get a solution that actually works. So it'll collapse because of the singular kind of focus as opposed to the multi-focus. So I really liked that, your articulation, and I love this pattern relationship flow, complementary redundancy resources as an ecosystem frame. It's really lovely.
Thank you. And you're right. I think we don't want to go into a marine ecology class here, but coral reef ecosystems, as you know, globally, they are under significant stress now because of climate change and pollution and so on. So it begs the question whether we're talking about human ecosystems, marine forests, like what's the tipping point? They're like there are some stressors that actually create conditions, like when you think about our communities, and you talk about, for example, child welfare, like next to indigenous kids, the highest proportion of children in the system taken away from their families are Black children. And so when you talk about the determinants of child welfare, you cannot have that discussion without paying attention to the other things listed here, like housing, around the mental health of and education and income support systems for families. Yeah. And so everything is interconnected. So this Cartesian reduction world that we live in has taken the whole out of the equation, and that's why, like, we have a social service. I'm sorry to say to use the phrase, but a social service industrial complex here that has projectified solutions, but has packaged solutions that are systemic in nature into project dollars and project plans. In fact, like, what delivers change in the long term is paying attention to our relationships, how things evolve. And that's why, for me, I think there has been a sense of frustration over the years, observing the socioeconomic indicators not shifting despite investments, because the design, the approach has not worked. And so it's almost like it's going back to the first principles here. It's going back to the foundation and saying who we are as people. We're people that relate to one another. We're not people locked in a job description and a title. We're working in a team environment. And so how do we start approximating the reality of who we are as human beings, as society, when we try to start thinking solutions? Yeah. And so that's why I think,
Yeah, Aman, thank you. There was a question or a couple questions raised by Amanda in the chat. I just wanted to call that out a little bit and see who are the leaders in nature, and how does nature change mindsets? I'm not sure, Amanda, if you have anything to add to that question or comment, but Aman?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, like, in the context of the work that we do, and this is the construct that has been created by the way that funding and solutions have been thought of. We have created organizational leaders. We have created little heroes that are meant to kind of deliver results for us. But I think in the work that we do, we're saying, like, let's intentionally move from those models that have not worked to one where we start facilitating and investing in collaborative leadership or collective leadership. Yeah. And I think in nature, in marine ecosystems, you will see that in marine ecosystem, no one actually dominates. The coral polyps are so important, but the coral polyps cannot do what without the involvement of nutrients. Currents are important. Sunshine is important. The various components of the ecosystem have a role to play. And in the context of our communities, I think the takeaway is we need everybody around the table, but everybody doesn't play the same role. People bring their niche, their skills, their experience, their realities, their context to the table. The key question is, how do we facilitate that? How do we amplify what the good people are bringing to the table. Yeah. What we're doing, we're designing programs, we're designing solutions and expecting people to fit instead of starting from where people are at. Yeah. So I think, I agree, Simon. Every leader or actor has a unique ecological niche. My training as a marine ecologist was to focus on coral reefs, and I started this in the southern Red Sea, understanding the diversity of coral species. There's a very rich species and diversity there. But I quickly realized that corals in themselves alone are not a story. Corals assume meaning in relationship to others in the ecosystem, the coral reefs, especially fringing coral reefs. Yeah. And so I started paying attention to the algae, to the water. I started analyzing the water. I took samples of seawater and to study them in a lab in Germany many years ago, to understand what's the role of phytoplankton, which are invisible to our eyes, but put under the microscope, they have an important role in terms of the food cycle in an ecosystem. Yeah. And so the recognizing that everybody has a role is important. And I think, I think the work that Kati and I and others in ILA are doing at the moment is like, we have created this kind of silo and facets of imagining leadership in a different way. How do we actually start linking and looking at a new way of imagining what leadership is? Because if we allow coral reefs, for example, that are under stress, they revitalize when they are left alone. That's why we create marine protected areas. Yeah. Sometimes, instead of parachuting project solutions in these communities, is allowing communities to be and stepping back and learning from communities. Yeah. And sometimes it's almost like going to those spaces with open-ended questions and asking, so that you allow yourself to listen and learn what would work for communities.
I had a very big reaction to like snapping and clapping when you said that, like leaving communities alone. And I think it's just also important to, like, as you leave communities alone, but not to like take the resources with, right? Like they need full access to the resources and also to be left alone, right?
Very true, Kara. I think part of living communities alone is actually understanding what's the flow, what's the energy flow in these communities, what are the patterns that are emerging, like in some of the indigenous communities, for example, that I had the opportunities to connect, mothers and fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and elders have a certain role to play. Yeah. There are certain teachings and value systems that are important. Yeah. And then I think by really understanding how communities are structured, how they function, what it does is like, we're trained to solve problems. We're trained to deliver solutions. How do we do that? We create projects. We hire people. We put people in boxes.
Right.
Yeah. So if we start moving away from that and saying, what's like one of the things that we often don't talk is culture. How is then culture in networks and organizations actually the glue, the soup over which everything is coming together? We don't pay enough attention in organizations to really question the cultures that we have. Yeah. In some of the training that I give, for example, to boards around governance, I talk about the intentional need to build a culture of collaborative inquiry at the board state, and in doing that, how do we actually start talking about how board meetings would be different? Yeah. How governance would be different. We talk about, as Ryan talks in governance, talk about generative conversations. How do you create generative conversations at the board table? Yeah. So I think we have an opportunity here to learn from communities, how communities function. And I think one of the things that I spoke about, for example, is this idea of networks of change. At the moment, we are investing, I don't know, in 5-7 networks through grants, but also through learning and capacity building. One of which is, for example, one that has been doing work around food security, but they moved from a concept of food security to food sovereignty. And our role there has been just to step back and learn from them and be present in ways that amplifies what they're doing. Yeah. So sometimes we have to step back from this interventionist mindset. Yeah. Intervention and projects and solutions, and step back and say, hey, let's understand the forest first before we're lost in the trees.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I said that comment in the context. I'm in Arizona right now, on kind of on vacation, working vacation, and I have family here, and my family is a member of the Navajo Nation. And she said in New Mexico, the Navajos nation, lost half of their nation died in New Mexico during COVID. And they were, what reason they've been able to survive so long is mostly because they have been left alone. But it's the resources, like they still, like in our modern world, like resource, yeah, just being thoughtful about making sure people have what they need. I think that's like the patterns and the inquiry, right? Like, what do you need? It's like, we're not doing interventions with what we think you need. You're going to tell us what, or not even tell us, like, I don't even know. It's like, I don't need to be a middleman here, right? Like, how do people go to source, essentially?
Yeah. I mean, part of this is especially with traditional communities, indigenous and other traditional communities. It's really what I have learned is really approach the space from a sense of humility and learning. And so when in 2013, for example, I co-chaired the National Conference on Indigenous, Non-Indigenous Canada with a young Aboriginal leader, the first thing that we have done was throw out our traditional conference organizing template and go to Indigenous leaders and say, what's the right thing to do in terms of really having a national conversation, difficult as it is, on the relationship of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. From what they shared with us, we developed some principles and approaches of how this conference was going to be different, how the format, the composition, the content, the speakers, the engagement would be different, because we were guided by the approach that they shared with us. And so that simple question of what's the right thing to do here allowed us to actually learn something that guided a year and a half of preparation that led to this conference. So sometimes Kara and all of us, I think, is almost like mobilizing our active listening skills, yeah, and stepping back and learning from communities. Communities are resilient if they are allowed to be, exercising leadership in ways that not only make sense to them, but they are guided by their own value systems. When I share about, the Nguzo Saba principles, for example, these are important 7 principles widely understood in people of African descent, whether you're in Brazil or in Africa or in Canada. These principles have come through generations, through oral culture and so on. They are important, that guide the relationship among people of African descent. So people try to embed this in the way that they do business among themselves and with others, yeah. And so it's almost like it's your GPS in a way. Yeah? There's something that grounds you in a way that you do your work, yeah.
Aman, I just wanted to note that there were a couple other comments in the chat. Simon raised a couple some points there, kind of along the way. I do believe he asked a question. What I'm guessing is, if we're to consider the village to raise the solutions for any communities, Black or not Black, is it not the relationships between all actors the mindsets of all actors is what needs tending to.
And it is because I think, like, Simon, you're right. Like when we talk about that architecture of engagement that I was talking about, it's very important that we recognize, the various stakeholders here. So one of my colleagues, she's the director for network weaving, for example, among other things. She's actually literally her role is to understand the network and create the capacity for us to do network weaving. And we're starting that by doing a mapping. We're actually working with a provider to use a technology to do social mapping, to really understand the relationships, the actors, and so on. In housing, for example, private sector players, government, non-profit housing providers, phase leaders, all these and others have a role. Understanding what's the value add that they bring into creating solutions around housing is important. Then facilitating their participation is important. So I agree with you. We need to shift the mindset. Like if any one of those players think that they can deliver housing solutions by themselves, we need to remind them through learning and other tools that you cannot do that, because housing is a complex challenge, requires collaborative solutions. You need, developers at the table, you need government at the table, you need private sector at the table. And so shifting their mindset would be important. Yeah. So in spring, we're bringing all these various players around housing in the Black community through a new Black Canadian housing network. We're launching a Black Canadian housing network as the platform to bring all these various players based on data and evidence to first exchange that service coordination I was talking about, knowing the right hand, allowing the right hand to know what the left hand is doing, but also in that process, creating the conditions for people to start working different. So shifting their mindset of all the actors would be important. And I think some of the work that Otto Scharmer has done at MIT through TREU and others, there's a toolbox that we start allows you to really recognize the inherent biases and cynicism that you hold that, prevents you from fully being present and interacting with others. So definitely, Simon, yes, we need to work on that. And there are some tools for doing that, yeah.
Aman, you're kind of referencing, even Kathy brought up a question in the chat, what is it about our need to control that causes us not to enter into a collaborative inquiry, that very thing about what our own, anyway, so it's an interesting question. And
I was thinking about it also in relationship to people who want to come in and do single interventions in the system. Is that more about ego or, wanting to hold power to say, this, I have the fix for you, kind of. There's no collaborative kind of reciprocity in that framework, or the idea that you could provide resources and leave things alone, and it could get, the system could come back into health. We have this kind of very old frame that change doesn't happen unless it's supervised.
It's so true, so true. And then the other thing, Kathy, to this is, and that's why in our discussion with governments and funders, it's like, when you're engaging community leaders, can you please sit at the table, stay? We want to have a discussion about data and systems change, not necessarily funding. Funding as an instrument would come later on, but let's look at the data together and let's understand what the scope of the problem is. And do we have some shared solutions? Then we can talk about resourcing the solutions, because what happens is, like, by fronting funding and designing funding programs, what we're doing is, like, we're first of all fragmenting leaders. We are moving that collaborative capacity from them of working together. The other thing that we're doing, we're perpetuating this mindset that, leaders, entrenched in their silos, they are going to deliver results. No, they are going to deliver to you units of service. They are going to do a lot of noise, but at the end of the day, year after year, in some cases, decade after decade, you're sitting in the same systemic problems.
Actually, we've brought the assembly line into philanthropy, into programs, into community work, and it's not an assembly line. It's pattern, relationships, flow, connection.
Very true. Very
It's,
true.
yeah, the other thing I really enjoyed about what you were talking about is that you basically are helping people see the system and bring it into view, and then approach the challenges through an integrated system connected view. And that's, I love your question of, what helps leaders change their mindset.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think that's fundamentally, if we're only going to do one thing in this, let's say, next decade, if we do that, all kinds of other things can open up. So
Yeah.
it raises really interesting questions about where we focus.
Yeah.
Are almost out of time, so
Yes, yes. I think, Kathy, my last comment would be also is what I find also useful is immersing leaders in places and situations where solutions have been identified and have worked. Like, for example, we sponsor a lot of leaders to visit from various cities to other cities where things are working on the ground. Yeah. And it's almost like that show and tell is important. And so from Halifax to Calgary, from Calgary to Ottawa, from Ottawa to Montreal, from Montreal to Vancouver, what's working on the ground? How do we templatize? How do you invest in that learning experience so that other leaders come and see for themselves? So they say, okay, I could customize this in my place. Yeah. So there are different ways we can shift the mindset of leaders, but we need to challenge them first and challenge the funders to invest in the learning and in the relationship, not to invest in the entrenchment of silos. And that requires a paradigm shift.
Yeah, huge. Aman, this has been absolutely great. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and the deep wisdom that you've been accumulating over the course of your career. Lots of really stimulating things to think about. Again, next time, a month from now, the March 21st at 1 o'clock, we'll talk about what does resilience science tell us about key performance indicators that might help us think about our organizations and our communities and measure its resilience as opposed to its profitability or its productivity or its efficiency or its silos or whatever. If any of you would like to share something that you're working on or thinking about to enhance our collective thinking, feel free to contact me. I lifted my email in the chat. I know, Sukaya, we talked, I think, over a year ago about doing something around well-being at work. And Simon, you and I have had a connection around getting you to share some of the stuff that you're doing. So if you two are interested, let me know. If others are, please let me know. Thank you so much for showing up today. And thank you again, Aman. I think you're really starting, these are the deeper kind of questions that we have to be figuring out. So very fun. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, everyone.
Alrighty.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care, folks.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.